day of what would have been the NOTA conference. It's the NOTA webinars. As we all know, the conference is provisionally moved to May of next year. So today we're going to have Andrea Darling talking about her research on females who sexually abused in an institutional context that she did with herself and Simon Hackett. So I'm going to do the bios and stuff in a bit. Some housekeeping first. So could everyone make sure that they are on mute so that we don't get any random interruptions while Andrea is speaking. Also, if people want to ask questions, we're going to do about 20 minutes, stop, then there's some questions that can be asked around the first part of the presentation. So if you want to ask them yourself, please do so. If you would rather put them in the chat and have me ask them, that's absolutely fine. I'm happy to do that. Then we'll have the second part of the presentation and another set of Q&A. So without further ado, let me introduce Andrea. She's a postdoctoral research associate at Durham, and she completed her PhD in 2018. She has an operational background in child and adult safeguarding related to institutional abuse, and has conducted research as part of the independent inquiry into child sexual abuse. Alongside her post at Durham, she also works with the National Police Vulnerability Knowledge and Practice Programme. So Andrea's going to be talking today. She's going to be discussing the work that herself and Professor Simon Hackett from Durham were involved in. I don't think Simon needs an introduction to anyone on this webinar. So without further ado, Andrea, I'd like to give it over to you.
Thanks, Kieran. Let me just make a start by sharing my screen. And just check, can everybody hear me okay? Nods?
Yes, thank you.
Okay, great. Okay, so can everybody see the screen okay as well? Slides, yeah?
Yes, thanks.
Okay, great. So, well, good afternoon, everybody, and it's really good to be here. Thanks very much for the introduction, and thanks very much to NOTA for inviting us to talk about research. I'm really excited to see so many people have come along today and actually have an interest in this. That's really, really great. So in the session, I'm going to be talking about the key findings from my doctoral research, which looked at female-perpetrated child sexual abuse in organisational settings. And I just want to clarify from the start that when I talk about organisational settings, I'm referring not just to the physical environments of youth-serving organisations, but also to kind of the external settings that are connected to the activities of those organisations. So, for example, off-site sports competitions, online or virtual spaces, locations where youth club activities might take place and so on. So it's not just the physical environment of the organisation, it's anything that's connected with the organisation in other settings as well. So despite the increase in research and literature over the last sort of 15 years or so into both institutional child sexual abuse and into female sexual offenders, there's still a significant gap in the literature about the crossover, those women who sexually abuse children in organisations and institutions in which they work. So my research was basically the first major study which has looked at that phenomenon in detail, and I hope that the presentation today gives you a good overview of the issue, and one which is now becoming increasingly reported in the media, and we are seeing more and more coming through the criminal justice system as well. So in terms of the overall study, well, the aim was really to develop a wider understanding about this particular phenomenon, about these women who sexually abuse children in organisational settings, to understand about the impacts of abuse and the responses to it. And then the whole purpose in doing so was to try and look to how we can inform prevention efforts and respond more appropriately when cases arise. The presentation today I'm going to split into two sessions, as Kieran said, with a break for questions and discussion in the middle, and then perhaps a bit longer at the end to do the same thing. In the first session, I'm going to discuss the background and context to this particular issue, and then talk a little bit about the characteristics of perpetrators and victims, and then move on to focus on why some women sexually abuse children in this way, what the potential motivations and risk factors are, and then look at some case examples as well. And then in the second part of the session, I'll move on to discuss how the abuse happens, examine the offence processes identified in different types of cases, And then towards the end of the session, I'll discuss what the findings might mean for policy and practice and suggest some other areas for future research to build on this work. So in terms of background and context, or how big an issue is female-perpetrated child sexual abuse in organisations? Perhaps unsurprisingly, it's really difficult to reach accurate estimates, partly due to inconsistency and incompleteness of available data, but as well as the generally accepted underreporting of child sexual abuse in general and sexual abuse by women in particular. So in relation to rates of female-perpetrated child sexual abuse more generally, estimates are that women account for between 5 and 10% of all sexual abuse against children. However, an international meta-analysis in 2017 found that in victimisation studies in particular, women were reportedly responsible for 11.6% of sexual offences, yet only constituted 2.2% of those who were actually reported to the police. In relation to female-perpetrated sexual abuse in organisations more specifically, well, I'd say taking account of all the available information, women are probably estimated to constitute between 3 and 30% of child sexual abusers in organisational contexts. And that does tend to vary depending on the type of institution. So you tend to see higher rates, at least higher rates are reported within the education sector, for example. Several inquiries and research studies all tend to find reported rates of around 7 to 10%. So for example, the latest statistics from Operation Hydrant in the UK, which records police reports of non-recent child sexual abuse, their figures show that where the sex of alleged perpetrators was known, 7.4% were reported to be female, although that would take into account both adult perpetrators and female children who may have displayed harmful sexual behaviour. So in this slide, just for interest, you can see this is Operation Hydrant data, and it shows the breakdown of the institution types featuring on the Operation Hydrant database where child sexual abuse has been reported. There's about 4,000 different institutions have been reported so far within that database. And you can see that almost 40% of those have been in relation to educational institutions, 17% for children's homes, 11% religious institutions, 10% in relation to sport, and 9% in relation to different associations and clubs. So moving on to our research study, well, the research involved both qualitative and quantitative content analysis of documentary material, so publicly available documentary records of cases where women had sexually abused children in organisational settings when they were working there in positions of trust or volunteering there in positions of trust. And those records included law reports, professional regulatory body decision records, and media records. And the example in total consists of 136 cases, and that included some which arose in the UK, in the US and Canada between the years of 2000 and 2016. In actual fact, 61% of the cases are related to the UK, 23% in relation to Canada, 16% in relation to the USA. So let's look at the findings regarding the characteristics of victims and perpetrators from the sample. So we'll see, in terms of age, most women were aged between 26 and 31 years old at the time of the abuse, although the age range actually spanned from 31 to 56 years, with a mean age of 31.2 and a modal age of 26. Although most of the women in the study were actually under 30, it is notable that over 10% were over the age of 40. The findings broadly reflect those of previous studies into female sex offenders more generally, which have also found more commonly that female sex offenders tend to be in the age range of 26 to 36 years old. But in comparison to the age of male abusers abusing in organisations in previous studies, our findings show that these women tended to be younger than men who were doing similar things. Where ethnicity was known, the majority of the women in the study were actually white, with only a few of Indian, Pakistani, Asian origin. One woman was Hispanic and one was of a mixed ethnic background. And again, those findings accord very similarly with other female studies into female sex offenders more generally, where samples have shown high rates of white female perpetrators. What's interesting is that most abusers were in adults' partner relationships at the time of the abuse, and that 2/3 of them actually were in adult relationships, which includes either being married, being engaged, or with some kind of long-term current partner. And these findings reflect higher rates of women being married or in relationships at the time of offending than most other female sex offender studies that detail marital status. It's also a somewhat higher of a rate compared to married men who have sexually abused children in organisations, as we've found in other studies as well. It's quite an interesting difference. Only 2 cases in the whole sample of 136 involved co-perpetration, and in both cases that individual was a single male co-perpetrator who was the female abuser's partner at the time. So that reflects a very low rate of co-perpetrating females compared to most other female sex offender studies, even those with higher rates of women who offended alone. Over half of the women were in an established stage of their career at the time of the abuse. Now, by established stage of the career, I mean somebody who's been in the profession for more than 3 years or not new to the profession and have some experience in the field. Newly qualified staff constituted 1/3 of known cases, and 11.7% of the women actually held senior positions in the organisations in which they worked. So, for example, they were deputy head teachers, heads of department, or senior supervisors. And this slide basically just shows the breakdown of the sample in terms of professional role. So you'll see then that the vast majority of perpetrators worked in or for educational institutions, primarily teachers and also teaching assistants. High school teachers were definitely the most common included in the sample. The next most common position of trust was residential care workers at just over 4%. And then others included sports coaches, social workers, a cadet officer, a church youth group leader, school transport supervisor, college lecturer, nursery worker, and tutor. So a wide range of different professional roles and responsibilities. Now, if we look at the victim characteristics, the majority of abusers had one known victim. So that was 86% of the women were known to have abused against one individual victim. Due to the nature of most of the data sources which protected victims' identity, couldn't determine the ethnicity of the victims. But although perpetrators in the sample abused male victims more often, you can see basically 3/4, more than 3/4, around 1/4 of them abused female victims. And only one woman out of 136 actually had victims of both genders. In terms of victim age, well, they ranged from under a year old to 17 years old, with a modal age of 16. And only 3 women offended against children under the age of 12. So therefore, the majority of victims were pubescent or post-pubescent at the time of the abuse occurring. And it's particularly notable that 2/3 of the women offended against 15 and 16-year-old victims. There was also evidence available in 17% of the cases that the victim had some kind of longer-term vulnerability in addition to their vulnerability of being a child. The most common of those additional vulnerabilities were learning difficulties, emotional behavioural problems, being looked after children or living in care. In addition to the information on those longer-term vulnerabilities, there was also evidence in almost 1/3 of cases that the victim was known to be experiencing particular issues or problems in their lives around the time that the abuse occurred. And the most common of those were domestic and family problems, emotional difficulties, problems with friendships and relationships. Other issues were difficulties with schoolwork, discipline, behavioural problems at school, concerns about developing sexuality. And we'll see the importance of those when we move on to look at how and why the abuse occurs later. So the findings regarding both why and how this abuse are often interrelated. And I'm going to discuss them in separate sections in this presentation, but given the interconnectedness, there is clearly some overlap between the findings and discussions in relation to the separate research questions. So why did it happen? Well, perpetrators rarely had any previous criminal or professional misconduct histories. Only 2 women in the sample were known to have had any kind of previous criminal record prior to the abuse, which would have featured in any pre-employment criminal record checks. And neither of those women had crimes which involved children or sexual offending. And that's an extremely low prevalence rate of previous criminal history, significantly lower than that found in the backgrounds of other female sex offenders more generally, and in male perpetrators who abuse in organisations and institutions. So, for example, Coulson and colleagues' 2013 meta-analysis found that 38.5% of female sex offenders had preceding criminal records. So, however, given the women in the sample were working in positions of trust and therefore would generally have been subject to pre-employment police checks before they start taking up post, then it's not really too surprising that that is the lower rate reported. The findings here are similar, however, to those of Aruga and colleagues' research from 2012, which found that only one of their sample of 19 predominantly male adults who'd sexually abused children in organisations had any previous criminal convictions. Most women also had no known previous professional misconduct history, so again demonstrating there would be nothing identified in standard pre-employment checks that would raise concerns about the individual's behaviour with children. Only 7 women in the sample did have previous concerns raised about inappropriate conduct towards children, and those involved inappropriate relationships and friendships and socialising with young people, inappropriate physical contact with children, breaching boundaries with children, and contacting children or young people outside of the work environment. And interestingly, in most cases, the behaviour was not considered to be sexual misconduct or to have been sexually motivated by women's employers and colleagues at the time. Yet in all of them, behaviour was a potential indication of inappropriate boundaries with children displayed by women who then later on went to sexually abuse other children in their care. Only 2 women had previous professional misconduct records which related to sexually inappropriate or abusive behaviour towards children. And in both cases, those concerned allegations of previous inappropriate relationships with students or pupils. So the findings that the vast majority of these women had no previous criminal or employment misconduct histories and had been working successfully in the professions for a number of years prior to the abuse occurring supports the view that situational and contextual factors influence their behaviour rather than any predisposition to sexually offend or any particular sexual interest in children. Similar to women identified as teacher lover types in previous studies and typologies, those who've abused in educational environment and those who've abused in educational environments, women in this sample had less known personal abuse experiences and fewer mental health difficulties than found in other general female sex offender studies. However, the perpetrator's personal circumstances in the pre-offending period appeared to have a particular bearing on the sexually abusive behaviour. Typical problems identified were relationship problems, emotional vulnerabilities, loneliness, low self-esteem, and immature thinking and behaviour. And the vulnerabilities identified in those women in this sample, those ones that I've just referred to there, are similar to those found in other studies of female sex offenders. Emotional vulnerabilities, low self-esteem, relationship problems, and feelings of isolation and loneliness meant that some women sought intimacy with children and young people that was lacking in their lives and in their relationships with adults. And in such circumstances, they established closer emotional relationships or friendships with children and young people that were not well supervised and that were less likely to be regarded as risky than equivalent relationships between male adults and children. Additional nurturing roles many of the women performed, such as acting as a mentor, a tutor, or a confidant, or a behavioural support worker, fostered closer relationships and the development of sexual feelings towards their victims. And additionally, some of the women displayed particularly immature thinking and behaviour, as we'll discuss later and examine the offence processes a little bit later. So overall, most women appear to be primarily motivated by intimacy needs, followed by sexual gratification. The fact that many victims were particularly vulnerable children or adolescents, is a clear concern. And a significant number of the perpetrators were acting in the capacity of a formal or informal mentor or confidant to the victim at the time. And in those circumstances, close contact between the child and young person was given some legitimacy, which allowed them to spend more time together, alone, and for privileges to be shared between them. So given that, like many other male and female perpetrators of CSA, the majority of the women here do not appear to be predisposed to abuse, it's clear that situational and environmental factors are important in explaining why this abuse happens. Organisational and environmental factors provided opportunities for inappropriate relationships to develop and for the sexual abuse to occur. The data also reflected how the organisational contexts themselves can provide cues, social pressures and environmental stresses that contributed to the perpetration of abuse. In considering why some women sexually abused in their professional care, the research findings highlight the need for a shift in thinking from individual predispositional explanations of the past to consideration of the influence of situational and contextual factors in the perpetration of child sexual abuse. And it needs to be recognised that organisational environments themselves and the adult and child relationships that are fostered within them can actually initiate sexually abusive behaviour by some women. That is not to excuse it, just they can be initiators. So I wanted to move on now and have a look at some case examples and some of the specific risk factors and motivations identified in those. So in the first case, this concerns a 43-year-old married primary school teacher who sexually abused an 11-year-old male pupil and continued abuse over a 3-year period. So that teacher had been working in the profession for several years at the time of the abuse, had no criminal record history or professional misconduct history. She was considered a dedicated and an excellent teacher, and she was someone who was seen as being going above and beyond the requirements of the role she performed. And at the time of the abuse, the victim's family were experiencing financial deprivation. There were some different problems at home. The victim in that case was significantly impacted by the abuse, including engaging in drug and alcohol abuse from the age of 12. He disclosed the abuse to his mother 5 years later and sought therapy, but he wasn't able to report the matter to the police until 11 years after the abuse had actually started. The teacher considered the matter to be a romantic affair and that she'd fallen in love with the victim, and maintained that she didn't recognise the abusive nature of the relationship at the time. She viewed the situation as akin to young love and said she felt exhilarated when she was with him. Forensic psychiatrist in the court case considered the abuse had resulted from the teacher's original desire to help the victim, who she'd identified was experiencing similar issues that she'd experienced herself when she was younger. The teacher had said she'd identified with the victim, that she'd experienced similar family problems as a child, and she was trying to help and support him. But she also said that she'd been questioning the direction of her life at the time of the abuse, feeling that she'd outgrown her long-term husband and was feeling completely unfulfilled in her life at the time. The abuse also occurred soon after the end of the teacher's extramarital affair with another adult male, and at a time when she was investing all of her energy into her work and volunteer activities in the community, much of which brought her in contact with children and young people. So we can see in this case the presence of a vulnerable victim and a perpetrator with emotional problems and relationship issues. She was also working particularly hard at the time, like I said, spending much of her time with children and young people. So in the second case, this involves a 45-year-old head of department who had sexually abusive relationships with two 16-year-old male pupils over a 3-month period after she befriended the boys at school and began to spend time with young people outside of school. Rumours circulated in the community about her contact with young people, and a member of the public reported the concerns to the police. The teacher eventually pleaded guilty to 3 counts of sexual activity whilst in a position of trust and was sentenced to 2.5 years custody as a result. The teacher said that she was suffering difficulties in her marriage at the time and was feeling isolated and lonely at the time of the abuse. She'd also been experiencing depression and had been prescribed antidepressants in the pre-offending period. So here we see another example of a woman with relationship difficulties, feeling isolated, and also in this case experiencing mental health difficulties. And in the third case, this is the 38-year-old teaching assistant who had online and contact sexually abusive relationship with 13-year-old male pupil over a 9-month period. She had an adult partner at the time and had been working as a teaching assistant for 17 years. She had no criminal record history, but had received a warning at work the previous year for inappropriate conduct with another older people. The inappropriate conduct wasn't described, but it was considered not to have been sexual at the time, but something that happened as a result of her naivety. Despite that warning, the teaching assistant was well regarded within the school and where she worked, and she taught new teaching assistants about appropriate boundaries and the ban on out-of-school contact with children. The abuse was discovered when a colleague overheard the victim talking to a friend, and the teaching assistant denied the abusive relationship and maintained that the boy had a vendetta against her because she'd been trying to discipline him and that she had been trying to support him for the problems that he was having at school. However, the police found computer evidence of her contact with the victim and with another older male pupil on her personal equipment. She eventually pleaded guilty to the 2 offences of sexual activity with a child and 1 of sexual activity in the presence of a child. The judge in sentencing described how the teaching assistant had engaged in abusive contact for her own sexual gratification. The teaching assistant said she'd engaged in a relationship with a much younger boy. She'd suffered abuse in previous adult relationships, and that the younger pupil was less likely to inflict levels of physical abuse that she'd experienced with adult partners in the past. So these cases exemplify some of the different motivations and risk factors found in women who sexually abuse children in organisational settings. We'll return to the cases a little bit later in relation to the offence processes, but now I was just thinking it's probably a good time to pause for a little while and answer any questions or any comments that you may have at the moment.
Thank you, Andrea. That was really, really interesting and really insightful. So hopefully there is going to be a couple of questions around the first part of the presentation. As church prerogative, I've got a question, and one of the things that I thought was really interesting is when you sort of look at the reasons why these women committed sexual abuse of children, you preface it with, oh, there wasn't a lot of mental illness there. There wasn't a lot of abuse histories there in the way. So is that something that you expected to find, or is that bouncing back on stereotypes and cultural narratives? I just thought it was interesting that you felt the need to preface that.
Yeah, I think it's quite interesting because the majority of female sex offender studies that have been done in general, not those that look specifically at organisational abuse, tend to focus on and have found, high rates of problems with mental health, depression, anxiety, and sort of serious mental illness amongst female perpetrators. And that's what's quite interesting in this particular study. Although there are, to be fair, limitations on the data. In fact, we weren't interviewing individuals directly and being able to gather full case history. So, except there's some limitations there. But generally, the rates of mental illness or of mental difficulties seem to be significantly lower, which is quite interesting. But then again, when you think that these women were able to be kind of high functioning and working in sort of professional roles with a lot of responsibility, that might also be linked to the fact that a lot of them were able to cope with or didn't have particular mental health problems, but there were other issues going on for them at the time. I just think it was an interesting finding.
Thank you, Andrea. So you've got a deluge of questions now. So 2 on the chat and 1 in person. So I'll just take them in the order that they are. So Amanda Robertson asks, how do you make sense of the difference between the contextual factors, vulnerability, and situational elements?
Well, it's definitely it's an individual case by case basis. I would say in pretty much all of the cases, so there was something going on in the person's own individual life, whatever that was. But the issue about, and we'll come on and we'll talk about this a bit more and how this abuse happens, is that the situational and contextual factors of the organisation itself are important in terms of the amount of time that women spend with children and young people and the nature of the relationships that they have with them, which taken together with whatever might else be going on in their lives can increase the risk of this type of abuse occurring, and that was seen over and over again in these cases.
Thank you. We've also got, just so that you're aware, we've got some feedback that your audio is dropping in and out a bit. So,
Is
uh,
it?
yeah, so
Keep
if
the
you could just
mic.
hold it,
Okay, I'll hold it close to my mouth. Yeah, sorry about that.
that's fine. Marcus, you have a question.
Yeah, hi Andrea, thank you
Hi,
for that.
Marcus.
That was really interesting and made a lot of sense. I was just interested in what sense you made of that high proportion of offenders from education settings, and if it's not jumping ahead to where you're going in the second part, specifically what you think the implications of that are for education settings.
Mm. Yeah, definitely. I mean, I have to say also, I think part of it would be the nature of the sample in terms of ability to access data, and a lot of the data came from kind of educational settings. However, having said that, we did look for cases in a whole range of different professional. What was interesting was like the medical profession. It was very difficult to find any cases that came up there. Now, I'm sure there occur, but to find data in relation to them. So I think some of it's potentially linked to the data and where we're able to class the samples from. But I also think it's the nature of the relationships that are built within educational context and the amount of time that children and young people are able to spend together. And I think particularly linked to the fact that a lot of the victims were aged 15 and 16. I think there's something about what's potentially going on in secondary schools and the relationships between female adults and teenage and adolescents teenagers and adolescents in those environments. I'm going to come on to talking sort of like how it happens and then in terms of implications for policy and practice moving forward as well. But there's certainly something that's very clear in terms of people not seeing women as potential abusers. And I think that comes out quite clearly too.
Yeah, thank you.
So you've got two questions left. Next is Natalie Mans, but I'm going to jump Natalie's. I'm going to ask the second question first because it relates to what you were just saying. So the second question is, could you just clarify how the participants were recruited?
Okay, yeah. So in terms of recruitment, it was, well, as I said, I used documentary case records. So we looked through kind of all different range of professional regulatory bodies. So this was in the UK, Canada, and America, to see where they had published publicly available data about cases that related to female sexual abuse of children in care. So we looked for kind of like health and social care records, teaching records, and so on. So that was one of the major areas of finding the data. Second one was to look at legal cases and law reports, so using online legal databases, sifting through those to find cases where women had sexually abused children and were working with the child in that context. That was the second major one. And then the third one, which was much smaller, was in relation to cases that we found that were being reported in the media. And kind of we tend to try to be able to triangulate those with the other data though from the other sample sources really. So it was you know, much of it was influenced by availability of data, but there is quite a lot of publicly available data when you go out and have a look, particularly in, like I said, the legal records and what professional regulators are reporting as well.
Brilliant. So Natalie's question to you was, did the motivational factors differ for those women whose victims were very young?
That's interesting because I think that the women who had victims who were very young happened to be the ones that were younger, happened to be the ones where there was a male involved, particularly the two where it was the only ones where there was co-perpetration, and they both involved young children under the age of 10. And I think in terms of the others, there were a few others that abused children kind of under the age of 12. But they were kind of more akin to those that abused older women. Now that's older children. That's not to say that the motivational factors for the co-perpetrators was that it was coercion or abuse, because there wasn't necessarily indications of that. It was potentially a choice made by the female perpetrator to engage in that stuff as well. So there wasn't any evidence of particular coercion or force to kind of engage in this type of activity. But then the others who'd abused against slightly older children, sort of like 10, 11, 12 onwards, tended to have similar types of issues to women who abused adolescents.
So I'm gonna allow this question because it links to Marcus's one. So Jacinta got a question in under the wire just before we move on to the second part. So this may be coming up in the second part, but I'll ask it anyway, and then after this we'll move on to the second part. So Jacinta asks, any feedback from local authorities, RE foster carers, and perhaps the propensity to overlook allegations of sexual harm in favor of pursuing allegations of physical harm, firm handling, etc.?
That is an interesting question. And just to point out, actually, we didn't include foster carers within the sample, and we specifically chose not to do that on the basis of the fact that although there is some kind of institutional oversight, the nature of how foster abuse happens within domestic context makes it more akin to interfamilial abuse. So we didn't include foster carers within the sample for that reason, because there wasn't really enough in terms of organisational oversight, to be fair. So I can't really comment fairly on that because I haven't gone and looked specifically at foster carers, to be honest.
Brilliant. So thank you. So we're going to move into the second part now. So just to remind you, Andrea, about the audio, and back to you.
Yeah, okay. Right, let's move on. Okay. Can everybody see? Can you see that okay? Audio okay? Keep it going. Right, excellent. Okay. So we're going to move on to look at how. How does this type of abuse occur? Well, so having considered the findings with regard to why the abuse occurs, let's look at how it happens and consider some of the common offence processes that have been identified. So as I explained earlier, almost all of the women were experiencing personal difficulties or stresses in the period leading up to the abuse. And as a result, I said, they'd inappropriately turn to children or adolescents in their care for intimacy, support, social contact and sexual gratification that was missing from their adult lives. And they developed inappropriate friendships or emotional relationships with children or young people, which then led on to sexually abusive behaviour. In some cases, it's fair to say the relationships would develop as a result of the adult ignoring her responsibility as an adult in a position of trust, and either failing to discourage or actively responding to approaches made by adolescent victims in particular. Okay. So 3 key approaches to the abuse were identified in the cases examined in this study. So the first involved a gradual development of sexual abuse following closer emotional bond between the adult and the child. The second saw the development of inappropriate friendships with children by some women who tended to display immature thinking and behaviour, and those relationships then became sexually abusive. And the third concerned those cases where the adult perpetrator tended to make more direct and explicit approaches to the victim or victims with the clear intention of achieving sexual gratification. So in the first scenario here, typically the perpetrator would begin to spend more time with the victim, and that often would take place on a one-to-one basis, and it would happen before or after the working day or during breaks in the working day. And she might also be supporting the victim with issues or problems, or they might have been helping her out with organisational projects, for example. Mobile phone or online communication would be established, and then the relationship would intensify. The perpetrator and victim would begin to meet outside of organisational environment, and sexually abusive behaviour would occur. Sexual contact tended to develop gradually in those cases, but eventually they did involve serious sexual harm, including sexual intercourse, penetrative acts, and oral sexual abuse. The abusive contact tended to be for a longer duration in those types of cases. In the second scenario, the perpetrator would typically overstep professional boundaries in her contact with children and young people, behaving immaturely, sharing personal information about herself, for example, and establishing contact with children and young people via social media. She'd spend time with groups of children in the organisational environment, developing sort of peer-like relationships with them, and then would begin to socialise with children outside of the organisation, often inviting them to her home for film nights or for parties or social events, and sometimes where alcohol might also be available. And within that context, sexually abusive contact with individual victims would begin, which would then generally lead on to more established relationship and expending an increasing amount of time specifically alone with the individual child and victim. And in the final case, a smaller number of cases, such as in the third scenario there, the perpetrator would actually make particularly sexually motivated and immediate and sexual explicit advances to the victim, either via personal interaction or online or via social media. And in those cases, there was usually a clear intent for sexual contact to take place, and plans would be made fairly quickly for that purpose. In those cases, the sexually abusive behaviour was much more serious from the outset, but may not have continued on for a long period of time. So in terms of locations and context where the abuse occurred, much of it took place in the context of less formal relationships and environments where professional boundaries were more relaxed. So for example, on organisational trips, at social events, or in the process of sports coaching, for example. Much of the abuse took place outside of the organisational environment, and quite often at the perpetrator or the victim's own home, or in the perpetrator's car. Although having said that, over 40% of the cases involved sexually abusive contact which took place in the organisation itself. The use of mobile phone and online communication was common, both in facilitating the abuse and as being the location in which some of the abuse occurred. In many cases, early indications of concern, so such as adults or children spending increasing amounts of time alone together, meeting outside of the organisational environment, or sharing personal contact details, for example, were not appropriately identified or responded to by colleagues, by employers, parents, or guardians, which resulted in the development or continuation of sexually abusive relationships. So even where concerns had been raised and addressed to some extent, there was limited evidence of ongoing monitoring of the subsequent contact between the perpetrator and the victim. An organisational societal culture appears to have influenced the failure of other adults to identify or take appropriate action to address identified boundary breaches, some of which were very clear, and may have had a distorting effect on the perpetrator himself. Consequently, the abusive behaviour continued unchecked and in some cases escalated. So in some cases, the lack of definitive action by other adults appeared to reflect a number of different issues. One was an unwillingness to accept the possibility that a female colleague might act in a sexually abusive way, which goes back to the conversation we've just had there in the break. The second is an unwillingness to believe the allegations made by children and young people, combined with a totally unquestioning acceptance of the female adult's denial. There was also evidence of victim blaming attitudes and concerns about reputational damage, both to the organisation and to the perpetrator's own future career. So as we've seen, most typically the abuse followed some kind of gradual development of a closer relationship. So therefore, this longer process, along with the more explicit approach taken to the abuse, suggests that there should be more opportunities to identify concerning behaviour and intervene prior to sexual abuse occurring. So let's return to the case examples and let's have a look and see how the sexually abusive behaviour occurred in those circumstances, taking account of what we've learned here. So if you remember that first case, that was involving the 43-year-old primary school teacher and an 11-year-old boy that she was supporting before the sexual abuse began. So you can see in this case is an example of where the perpetrator develops a closer emotional bond with the victim. In this case, the increased contact between the perpetrator and victim started to occur before the very end of term 1 year, when the teacher wanted to continue to help the child during the holidays, and she asked if he wanted to earn some money by undertaking jobs at her home, as she was aware that his family was in financial difficulty. They began to spend more and more time together as the victim attended the teacher's home to do odd jobs over the holidays. And the teacher began to then take him on trips and do activities with him during the holidays, initially as a reward and as a treat for the work that he was doing. But she then began to buy him presents, took him on holiday, and had him stay overnight in her home. So after he left the primary school, the teacher maintained contact with him, and she actually brought him back to the school to attend a school trip after he'd already left. And she also helped him to transfer schools when he began to be bullied at his new school. The victim's mother began to become uncomfortable about the amount of time they were spending together and asked for the contact to stop. But the teacher befriended the mother, asking her to reconsider so that she could continue to help the child which the mother did, but then obviously, sadly, the abuse continued. The abuse only stopped when the victim moved away from the area and was finally able to cease contact with the teacher. And the victim in that case described how she'd made him feel complicit in the relationship, when he just viewed her as a kind of aunt figure who was helping, and he tried so hard to stop the sexual contact between them. So returning to the second case, so that was the one involving the 45-year-old teaching head of department developing friendships with young people and who then engaged in sexually abusive relationships with two 16-year-old male pupils. This case demonstrates how sexually abusive behaviour can develop from inappropriate friendships between adults in positions of trust and children in their care. And in this case, when the teacher began to develop friendships with the boys and their friends in school, she then encouraged them to use her classroom as a common room and spent time with them there during breaks and before and after school. Her contact with them developed as she took the boys and their friends for meals in local cafes and restaurants, and she gave one of the victims regular lifts to and from school. The teacher also began to then hold parties at her own home, supplied the boys and their friends with alcohol, and her behaviour was particularly risk-taking. She had sex with both victims within an hour of each other at one party, had sex with one of the victims on another occasion when her husband was asleep upstairs in the house. Returning to the third case example, so this was the teaching assistant who had online and personal contact sexual abusive relationship with a 13-year-old. This case is an example of where the perpetrator takes a more direct and explicit approach to the sexually abusive behaviour. And in this case, the abusive contact began when the pupil sent the teaching assistant a friend request on social media. She had also had contact with other young people via social media at the time, and although she declined this particular pupil's friend request, they began contacting each other directly and privately via email and MSN Messenger. The conversations were regular, often taking place late at night, and became sexual in nature. And during a webcam chat one evening, the teaching assistant exposed her breasts to the victim. They met up in her car a few nights later, where abusive sexual activity took place. The online contact and meetings carried on for 9 months until the boy ended the relationship after becoming concerned when the teaching assistant began to talk about running away with him. So the examples have demonstrated some of the different reasons why this type of abuse occurs, the risk factors and potential motivations, but then we followed that with an examination of the different ways and how it happens, looking at those different offence processes and situational and contextual factors relevant in the case examples. So having looked at those, I think it's probably good now to move on and have a look and see what the findings of the research might actually mean in terms of policy and practice in organisations going forward. So the research has a number of different policy and practice implications, most of which suggest that policymakers and practitioners need to be much more gender aware in their responses to this type of sexual victimisation. Elliott and Bailey in 2014 referred to a vicious cycle of public and professional minimisation of female-perpetrated sexual abuse, which in turn underestimates the reality of such abuse and then simply maintains the minimisation. And it's clear that this cycle also continues to exist in respect of female-perpetrated child sexual abuse in organisational settings. So in terms of policy, well, policy narratives need to challenge assumptions and stereotypical attitudes to perpetrators and victims of this type of abuse. Policies and guidance dealing with organisational sexual abuse should reference female perpetrators and include female-perpetrated abuse amongst the examples presented. As Smallbone and McKillop pointed out in 2016, policies and publications also need to encourage this shift in understanding among organisational leaders away from stereotypical views of risk arising from predatory paedophiles seeking to access organisations specifically to abuse, to an understanding that organisational abuse may be opportunistic and situational in nature. Recognition of this fact can lead to the adoption of situational prevention measures in organisations to help minimise the risk of such abuse occurring. So in terms of practice implications, well, you know, the difficult challenge of balancing the implementation of situational prevention measures without creating a culture of suspicion in organisations is fully acknowledged. By no means it's underestimated, and the difficulty of maintaining a healthy and pleasant organisational environment for children and adults is a difficult thing. Nonetheless, the research findings have a number of practice implications for organisations that provide care and services to children and young people. Organisational culture needs to challenge those gendered assumptions and stereotypical attitudes, and safeguarding needs to be seen as everyone's business and part of day-to-day operations. As well as having clear policies and procedures concerning appropriate staff boundaries and behaviours towards children, these need to be properly communicated, and any identified breaches need to be robustly explored and properly addressed. Employers and organisations need to move from an overemphasis on pre-employment police checks to more fully integrating ongoing monitoring of staff, particularly where any issues of concern are identified. Any mentoring or support arrangements between adults and vulnerable children should be closely monitored and supervised. And employers need to be cautious about informal relationships that arise between adults and children in positions of trust. And we've seen that in the case examples, and we saw it throughout the research. Colleagues need to be alert to women, the same as men, who begin to spend increasing amounts of time with children and young people that are beyond their usual duties, and particularly where that occurs with individual children. So given much of the abuse occurred outside of the organisational environment, employers, colleagues, and parents and guardians need to be alert to any occurrences of adult-child contact which occurs outside of the organisational environment. The particular risks that arise around virtual communication have been identified, and therefore there should be clear policies and procedures around such contact between adult staff or volunteers and children. The apparent prevalence of personal and emotional problems occurring for these women around the time of the abuse highlights potential warning signals for employers and colleagues. Additional support where female staff members appear to be experiencing personal or work stresses may help to prevent the development of inappropriate relationships. The provision of some kind of supervision similar to that experienced by social workers, counsellors and other professions may also be a beneficial approach here. So finally, I'd just like to reflect on some other areas for potential future research, because obviously this study has kind of just scratched the surface really of this phenomenon, and there's so much more that needs to be done. So our research has been the first comprehensive study which examines the phenomenon of female-perpetrated child sexual abuse in organisational settings and contexts. And it creates hopefully a good foundation for further exploration of this under-researched phenomenon. And there's so many different areas that require future research, but there are a couple in particular that we thought might be beneficial in the short term. And those two areas are, first of all, research to explore why employers, colleagues and parents sometimes fail to recognise and respond appropriately to early indications or even disclosures of female-perpetrated abuse. And by examining contemporary responses with individuals who've been involved in recent cases, we can hopefully develop a better understanding as to the factors that influence the lack of recognition and inappropriate responses to find improved ways to prevent future abuse of this type. The second key area of research would be research with women who've sexually abused children in organisational contexts themselves, to understand from their perspective the role that situational and contextual factors might have played and what prevention measures might be effective in these environments. And that would be similar to some of the few studies which have actually been done in relation to male perpetrators in youth serving organisations to date. However, obviously there's going to be a difficulty in being able to access samples. So again, that type of work would help us to tailor and develop specific prevention strategies to address this type of abuse. So that brings to the end of the presentation, but I just thought if you were interested in the subject and that you wanted to find out more about it, I've listed some of the other publications, and I think I'm right, Kieran, that the slide set will be sent out to attendees afterwards, so you'll have those links there. Is that right? Yeah.
Yeah, that's right,
Yeah,
Andrea.
yeah.
And you've just intercepted a question from Neve White, who said, "Could you recommend any further reading around this?" So
Okay. Yeah.
very much on the ball. So
Excellent. That's great. Well, I'm taking the opportunity to promote my own stuff, but obviously you can go and have a look at the reference lists within that for a much wider look. But the first in that list there is just basically a general introduction chapter about female child sex offenders. So if you want kind of a basic introduction to that. The second goes on to look at more detail in relation to these situational factors I've been talking about that are involved in this type of abuse, and what organisations can learn to prevent them. The third is a slightly different take, which looks at the comparison of male and female perpetrators, but specifically teachers. So that was in relation to another study that I did, looking at a small sample of male and female teachers. And then the final article kind of talks more in detail about the specific criminal justice responses to this type of abuse in detail, because there are some significant differences in terms of how male and female perpetrators are addressed. So that's a good place to go and have a look if you want to know a little bit more about that particular element. So as I said, I was really grateful that so many people have come along today, and that you found, hopefully found the interest of my research to be of interest to you. So I want to thank so many of you for coming along, having the opportunity to be able to take questions and see what people are interested in and to talk about this issue. So I think we've got a bit more time for discussion now, and I'm happy to answer any more questions that you have. I've put my contact details here on the final slide, but as I said, those will be coming out with the slide set, so you don't have to worry about jotting them down at the moment. They'll come out to you subsequently.
And just to remind, thank you, Andrea, and just to remind everyone, as well as the slide sets, this is being recorded, so you will be sent a link to the video recording of this as well, so you get the audio as well as the slides. So thank you. So we've got some time for questions, and we've got a question from Samantha Colton. No, that was just comments. Okay, so one of the first questions that we've got is from Jose. Thank you, Andrea. This has been great. Can I ask, was there data in your study on how the abuse was disclosed or discovered?
Yes, there was. And the full details of that can be obtained if you look at the PhD study, which is available on eThesis at Durham University. So yes, there is quite a bit of detail about that.
Could you just give us a snapshot?
I'll give you a teaser.
You don't want to go into massive detail,
yeah,
but just like one or two key points around it.
Yeah, the disclosures almost always did not come from the child themselves. So, and because a lot of them were a lot of the abuse occurred in relation to adolescents, a lot of it was through rumour circulating or friends of children themselves reporting to parents or reporting to school. Sometimes it was a case of kind of, again, I think in one of the examples, it was one of the adults at school overheard a conversation between two children, and that kind of triggered it. So, yeah, so the headlines basically that the disclosure didn't generally come from the individual themselves, it came from others around them.
Brilliant. Neem also has a second question, which is any information about the sentencing outcomes? Or is that also in the thesis?
That is also in the thesis, and it's actually in the final article. It's on that list there about the criminal justice outcomes. But again, to kind of just give you some headlines on that. Sentencing outcomes, women were sentenced generally for these types of crimes less severely than men, both in relation to general sex offending and in relation to specifically abuse that happens within institutions. Sentences, even where they are similar, female perpetrators tend to get suspended sentences and male perpetrators tended to get custodial sentences. So yeah, there's lots of detail in that third study, and there's even more in the thesis if you were really interested in it. But yeah, very noticeable differences. The highest rates in the criminal justice system in relation to female sex offenders in relation to organisational context relate to abuse of trust offences. So if you look at abuse of trust offences where an adult's engaged in sexual contact with a child in their care, aged 16, 17. Women represent, I think it's more than 1 in 6 perpetrators who've actually been convicted or cautioned for abuse of trust offences, which kind of links in with this whole thing about what's going on in secondary education, what's going on with adolescent relationships and so on. So yeah, there's lots more detail in that article and in the PhD thesis around that, but definitely sentencing disparities. Yeah.
Brilliant, thank you. Marcus, you have another question?
If I may, Andrea, you'll be aware of the interest that's growing in low-level concerns approach. And I was just wondering, particularly given the sort of difficulty that people seem to have in recognising concerning behaviour in women more than in men, kind of what your take is on that and what potential you think it might have.
I think, I suppose it comes back to kind of the policy and the policy and practice recommendations I was making there. It's about making sure that anything that's published, discussed, or put forward in terms of policy continuously recognises the fact that women can be perpetrators the same as men, and therefore, although the numbers are generally lower in organisations and the educational sector in particular, the numbers are really quite significant in comparison. So it's about just trying to communicate what the research is telling us and doing more research in this area for people to understand that women, I mean, there's a whole issue about women not being perceived as being able to be sexually abusive towards children. That's a whole issue. But the reality is, in organisational context, the numbers are actually quite high in some particular types of institution. It's about trying to continuously communicate that narrative that women can do this and do this and do this for a range of different reasons, and that needs to be taken into account. And the evidence is pretty clear that people are just not picking up on it, and I think that's definitely influenced by the fact that it's women, particularly in relation to this, the nature of the close relationships it's able to build between mentors. That's where it's particularly risky, I think, this thing where women are seen as a safer bet to provide mentor and support, and therefore there's just less suspicion about anything being a problem there, but actually that particular relationship can be an instigator for the abuse. That's what we see in the evidence. So yeah, it's an interesting one.
Thank you.
So we've got 3 more questions, 2 on the chat and 1 in person. So from the chat, Lucy Coleman asks, do any of the stats on sentencing include Scottish perpetrators, as we do not have suspended sentences or an equivalent?
To be fair, most of the statistics that I've got, certainly in the PhD, relate to England and Wales, police statistics within England and Wales. There is some stuff in there about Scottish cases in the PhD because I've included some Scottish cases, and I did look for data more in terms of barring and vetting and barring rates in Scotland. And I did contact General Teaching Council of Scotland and so on, and got some case data and stuff from them. So there is some elements in Scotland around Scottish data, but I have to say in terms of criminal justice, I didn't have the statistics in relation to Scottish offending convictions.
Thank you. Jacinta asks, any info on the views from female perpetrators themselves about women who abuse others?
Oh, that's an interesting question. No, actually, some of the women in the sample decided to kind of go to the media and kind of sort of put forward their stories, and in those, a lot of it is just about basically them justifying their own behaviour and trying to make themselves not out to be sort of an awful perpetrator kind of thing. But I have to say, having looked at any of those, I haven't seen them really talk about. I certainly think that they've seen themselves as outside of a female sex. They don't see themselves as sexual offenders, sexual abusers at all. But not in terms of any insights into what they've sort of specifically said about their views on others. So it's a really interesting question, actually. Yeah.
Now over to a live question. Penelope.
Hi, thanks very much for your presentation and your important work.
Hi.
I'm a therapist and I'm an ex-school safeguarding governor. Have you got any thoughts about how to carefully and appropriately raise awareness of female offenders amongst pupils? I realise that might be beyond the scope of your study, but just in terms of the fantastic insights you've gained.
Yeah.
You know, I just wonder what can be done so we could help kids to protect themselves better.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's, well, to me, it's kind of, it links in with kind of the sort of the personal health and social training education that kids get in school. And it's all part, it goes back to, it's all part of this narrative that when we talk about sexual abuse and sexual violence, that women, girls are also perpetrators, and therefore if we ever talk about examples, we should include women, girls as being perpetrators, or also children who demonstrate harmful sexual behaviour. So it's about, you know, it's the same as anything, describing who the people are who do this and who the people who might be victims of it is. It's anybody, and gender is part of that too. And I really do think there's something about using case examples and talking people through things that helps to kind of make it more real, actually, for people to kind of like understand them. I think that depending on how old the children are, it's appropriate to kind of do that. So obviously for younger children, it's just that it can be anybody. You know, it's not going to be a man in a Mac with a hat and a bag of sweets. It's going to be anybody who could be close to you for any reason. And I think there's definitely subtle ways, and certainly educators will be better at this than me, but there'll be subtle ways that you can do that. But it's just part of the narrative should always consistently have at least some reference to women as well as men being perpetrators, and victims being both genders too.
Or any gender, as you say. Yeah.
Any gender, that's right. Yeah, absolutely. That's a whole other area of research, actually, which would be very interesting to look at too.
Thank you.
Thank you. We have Lynn would like to ask a question about a woman that she's recently worked with.
Okay, just bear with me a second, because my battery is going low and I want to just make sure I'm plugged in so that my laptop screen doesn't go off. Just a second. Okay, there we go. Sorry about that. Right. Lynn wanted to ask.
Hi, Leanne, are you there? You raised a point in the chat. Well, we'll go away. Oh, here we go. Here we go.
Hi, Leanne.
I don't know if you're on mute. Okay, well, we maybe come back to that question because there seems to be some radio silence.
Yeah.
Lucy Coleman also asks if you think that this data will help inform or progress a female risk assessment tool.
I would hope so, yes, certainly. I know there's been some work done, and I'm not really up to speed exactly with what's happening within HMPPS around this at the moment, but I know they have been reviewing the risk assessment tool for female offenders, and there were some early conversations a while ago about whether I can have a look at some of that, and they are aware of the research. I know that as well, so hopefully, yes, it will help to contribute towards development of risk assessment tools for women.
Brilliant. I don't know if Leanne's back with us.
I think she just popped a little comment in there.
Yeah.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah, great. Yeah, so I'm a senior probation officer and I work for MPS, and one of my colleagues is also on the call. We recently-ish was working with a woman. She was she was a social worker / manager of a children's home, and one of the kind of typologies you talked about before, as we're on the call, I'm texting Kathy saying, "Oh my God, this is her, you know." So it absolutely fit so much of what you were saying. But the extra, suppose, dimension with this woman was that, I mean, she was a perpetrator, but he also then was abusive to her, and he raped her, and his mother was also involved with the abuse of her as well. So the dynamic completely changed, and it was really difficult to kind of work through that. And I got some support off, you know, somebody who's really knowledgeable about working with women nationally. But yeah, we just found it really, that extra dimension that was added to it. It was, where does one start, where does one stop, you know?
Yeah. How old was the how old was the person involved?
The victim?
Yes.
Yeah, he was, I think he was 14.
Yeah. So you do sometimes see that. Yeah, you do sometimes see that, and sometimes you see a defence of women will claim it was rape, or it was kind of them. But more often than not, that isn't actually the case, and that's not been played out in court. But that sounds like a particularly interesting case, though, if there's kind of much more to the dynamics of what's going on there. And it is a difficult one to certainly tease apart. But she's the adult in the position of trust and responsibility at the start when things begin to happen. So yeah, but interesting. I'm glad to hear that kind of talking through it is actually reflected in the cases that you've seen in practice as well.
Thank you. So we've got one more question on the books from Sharon Wareham. Great presentation, Andrea. Do you think how we frame female abuse of teens feeds into a lack of recognition of abuse, e.g. teacher/lover descriptions of abuse?
Yes, absolutely. Hi, Sharon. I can't see you on the video or anything, but yes, absolutely does. There's still this whole issue, and Kira and I were talking about this before we started with the session today, that there's just a complete lack of acceptance of the fact that these types of relationships are abusive, can be abusive, and the difference in gender perception, whether it's a male or a female perpetrator, and how that plays out, and you know, that it plays through cases that happen legally, how people are dealt with by professional regulators, and all those kind of things. And the thing is, it's been going on for a really long time, and it doesn't seem to be hugely progressing. But I think because this stuff is very sensational, and when you see it in media reports, I mean, there's a whole bit to be done. There has been some work done about like media representations and so on, but there's a lot to be said, particularly in relation to kind of teacher-pupil relationship, because it ties in, like you say, to that typology, the idea of that typology, teacher-lover, less harmful, done within the context of a loving and emotional relationship kind of thing, that also contributes and makes it much more difficult. But yeah, there's still, when you see how some of the media reports are framed, it's just generally quite horrifying, and it's quite shocking that it still kind of goes on in the same way, the same extent. We just have to keep putting the word out there and making sure that people are aware of the evidence and the real cases, and the harm to victims and survivors as well. You know, I haven't covered that in this particular presentation, but that is something I have talked about at other NOTA conferences, and I have done in magazine articles for NOTA as well. So there's definitely a lot to be learned in terms of victim and survivor experiences as well, and how it feels so much worse because people are not accepting that females can be abusive, and how that can make the experience for victims and survivors so much more difficult in disclosing, but then even after disclosure, like in terms of how people respond to it and how it makes them feel.
Thank you. Just a couple of another questions came up, and just something that might be of interest to people from Natalie Mann. She's pointed out that she led some research into an evaluation of female and juvenile bespoke risk assessment tools as part of the National Arms Evaluation, and she's put a link in the chat in case anyone wants to have a look at that. Excellent. So Kerry Russell asks, was there any cases of same-sex abuse, female abuser and female victim?
Yeah, about 25% actually were. And this is an area I found particularly interesting because there's very, very little in existing research around this particular area. And what was interesting in a number of these cases were there was no evidence that the adult female had had any previous sexual relationships with women. A lot of them were married. So there's a lot of quite interesting work to be explored around that particular phenomenon, and the fact that, again, when it is sensationalized, it's sensationalized even more if it's a woman, and a teenage girl or an adolescent girl. So yes, there were about a quarter of the case examples related to female victims and survivors.
So Robert Hancock asks, is there any evidence that young male victims have gone on to be perpetrators themselves?
In relation to organisational abuse in particular, I mean, in general, there's the whole discussion, we had this yesterday as well, in terms of like how much victimisation plays out in terms of future perpetrators, and that the vast majority of perpetrators have not necessarily always been previous victims, and the vast majority of victims don't go on to perpetrate and all that kind of stuff. In relation to this particular type of abuse, no, there isn't. I think there is evidence amongst female sexual offenders, or those who've been abused by female sex offenders, particularly like maternal offenders or interfamilial offenders. I think there is some data in other studies around how that plays out in terms of rape and serious sexual violence, but that is not an area of my expertise. So there is some stuff out there if you're interested in it, go and have a look, but it's not my area of expertise. But certainly in relation to organisational abuse, no, because we were looking at contemporaneous cases, so we've been looking at cases where you know, we don't follow the victims. We couldn't have followed the victims to know what the outcomes were for their own life further down the line, really.
So I've got a question. So, you know, going back to the start of the second part of your presentation, when you talked about the pathways and how it happens, you know, playing devil's advocate here, you could say, oh, well, that's very similar to grooming in male perpetrators. They do similar things. What would your key message, your key takeaway be that is different for female perpetrators as opposed to male perpetrators?
I think the biggie is, the first thing is to say, you know, I haven't never done a comparative study. What I've done is I've looked specifically kind of at female perpetrators and what's unique about them. But my general, you know, understanding and awareness about how child sex abuse in general happens is that I think the key in relation to what happens with women is the emotional investment in the relationships, in terms of how they come about and how persistent they are, and how women are some women are very, very reluctant to let it go, even when it's discovered, even when it's reported, even when they've lost their families, they've been prepared to move cities, they just want that relation because the emotional investment is really strong. So I think that's one issue. The other one comes back to what we said before about the lack of recognition of it. It is the same types of behaviour. There's nothing that specifically makes it that different in terms of the offence processes. It's just the lack of seeing that as a potential risk when it's a female. I think that those are the two issues. One is probably the emotional investment and the actual how and why it's happening. But then the second bit is how it's responded to, basically, and then how that kind of just allows it to continue to happen. Because there are numerous examples within the cases where indications or concerns have been raised, but there was just no ongoing monitoring, and it was just kept happening because nobody was taking it seriously enough.
Thank you. So we've got a couple of minutes left, and then I think Andrew's going to go lie down in a dark room and not talk for the rest of the weekend. You've certainly used all the words today, so that's good. Is there anything else, either in the chat or online and in person, that anyone would like to say to you, Andrew, before we draw this to a close? Any final questions? So we're all doing that first year undergraduate thing of staring at our feet and hoping to God no one makes eye contact, because eye contact means a question.
I've got something. Is there something I can say? Can I speak as well?
If you go for it.
Lovely.
It's your party.
Thank you. I know I said at the beginning, it was really good to see so many people come along, and it's really been really great to start having some conversations with people about cases that are coming up, or about how people address it and how you come across it in your own work and stuff like that. And I'm very keen to kind of continue to have those types of discussions, and hopefully next year at NOTA, at the conference, plug for the NOTA conference next year, it would be really great to have some kind of discussion group or forum, or just chat about this, because so many people have come along today and there's lots of questions, which is really, really great. So maybe there's another way that we can find to interact together and keep talking about this.
I love the way that you sort of publicly outed and shamed the conference. You you know, I'm sure you wouldn't do that to female perpetrators, and you wouldn't advocate naming and shaming, but you've got no issue doing it with Noda. But I think it's a good idea, and something we can definitely talk about and look at, because, you know, we are going to have to look at the conference schedule and what happens and the way it gets navigated, because COVID's had a massive impact. So I think it is something that we can do and we can facilitate.
Yeah.
So
yeah, no, it's not an intention to shame, and I know that when I've been and I've presented, people have always been really engaged as well. The numbers have been smaller, and I think maybe because we've been online, there's been an opportunity for lots more people to come along, which is great for me, because I'm just delighted to see so many people have an interest in it. So yeah, it would be really good to meet up with other people if they come along to Nota next time round and have a chat about some of this.
And there's been a few comments in the side saying that sounds like a good idea, and I think there's a couple of people that would be interested in that. So maybe that's something that we can sort of take away and think about. That would be quite useful.
Lovely.
So all it takes for me to do now is to basically say thank you, Andrea. That was a really engaging presentation. It was really enjoyable. People stayed to the end, they engaged, there was lots of questions. The work that you and Simon have taken part in around this is really influential and really helpful. So thank you very much for agreeing to do this, and thank everyone for giving up an hour and a half of their lunchtime to come and listen and talk about it. This has been the 4-day webinar event for Noda in place of the actual conference, which hasn't happened because, as some of you may have noticed, there's been a bit of an issue with COVID this year. So we hope to return in person to Leeds in May. Keep an eye on the website. We will be advertising it on there and having conversations through the Twitter account. So thank you very much, Andrea, and thanks everyone else for coming. Have a great weekend. Enjoy the sunshine while it lasts, and see you soon.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, Kieran. Thanks, Andrea. That was amazing.
Thank you. Bye.
Brilliant webinar. Brilliant. Thank you.
Okay, it's just the four of us left. I see Sarah's unmuted, and yeah, well done, Andrea. That was brilliant.
Oh, thank you.
Nothing to be nervous about.
Oh, well, I was dead nervous, but once I get in my stride and I'm talking about what I know I'm talking about, I'm fine.
It was excellent, that was.
No, thank you. I'm just having a quick look at some of the chat comments, so I definitely want to go through and have a look at those. It was really great to see so much engagement. I'm delighted, I really am.
I think I could safely say, having sat through all four this week, that you get the star prize. You know.
And in the middle of chat and stuff as well, yeah.
Yeah,
I've got lots of noise going on here, so I was on mute, and lots of people had questions to ask, so I left it to them. So.
Yeah,
that's really good. Thank you. No, I'm pleased, really pleased.
But seriously, I know I was joking about it there, but if you want to do something around this, a conference, whether it's a session or whether it's a discussion group or whatever it happens to be, send me some ideas and we'll figure something out, because you know, this was the biggest number of attendees, and they stayed and they asked questions, so there's obviously something here that people want to talk about. The only issue that we have, Andy, is I was contacted by one of the speakers who got one of the participants who got quite nervous about the MPS question. So the Leanne one, when she talked about a female that she had worked with. So I wonder if we can remove that.
Oh, sorry, yes.
We can edit that out of the final version.
Yeah, I'll look at that. I mean, to be fair, I was nervous when she first started saying it, and I'm like, oh, but she didn't really say anything she just sort of said, I mean, I think we should take it out, but
yeah,
what she said was vague enough, I think,
Yeah.
to be okay.
And while it was useful for you to hear that what you were saying sort of reflected practice, I don't think that it really added much to the overall direction and tone of the conversation. So I don't think we would lose a lot.
Yeah.
But by having that, because if we were in person, she wouldn't have stuck her hand up and asked that question in front of the audience. That would have been a quick tap on the shoulder at coffee.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. But yeah, I think it would. I mean, I think what I was surprised about was the number of people who wanted to come, because it is quite a specific thing. But normally, what I get is people just want to know generally about female sex offenders, or it's just anything at all they can get about female sex offenders. And normally, the questions relate to female sex offenders. But actually, what's been really interesting is they have specifically been interested in those who are abusing in organisations, and I think that's quite different to what I expected. Like when I've had them come along to previous conferences, it's just anything that's got female sex offenders, because there's not enough stuff out there and people don't know what to do with them. And so what was quite interesting today, there was a lot of the questions coming in and around those in that particular sector, which is a bit different to how it's been previously. And I am genuinely very surprised by the numbers, because originally I kind of thought, well, I wouldn't be surprised if you turn around and say, look, we haven't had enough people sign up. So I just, yeah.
You're the biggest, I don't think I'm sort of breaking confidentiality in saying this. On average, we've had about 40-ish people the last 3 days. Today we had about 62.
Yeah.
So it's of interest, but you know, you did really well, and I think you deserve to go and lie down and never speak again for like a week or so. But that was brilliant, Andrea. Thank you ever so much.
No problem. Thank you. Yeah, so can I just, Andy, you'll be able to get me the chat in some way, shape or form?
I want to get your chat and I'll send that to you this afternoon. So you it's only in a raw text format. So
yeah, that's fine.
But I'll send it, Andrea.
Really helpful. Thanks very much. And Malcolm said you get some kind of general feedback forms and you just you'll send them on as they come.
Yes, I'll send the survey out this afternoon as well, and I'll get that over to you next week.
Okay, excellent. Right, well, lovely to see everybody. Thanks very much for the opportunity. I'm going away buoyed. I'm pleased it went well, and also that so many people found it helpful, so that's really good. Excellent.
Brilliant. Thanks, Andrea.
Well, take care.
Bye.
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 Bye. That was all great, I think. I think we got, a really good level of interest. So all round, not just today. So I mean, obviously today's, but a few small technical issues, but nothing that was like, that would put me off doing it again, to be honest. So
I thought it's gone really well. Really well.
Yeah. And we had a lot of repeat customers, so we did. So there was people like Lucy Coleman who was back every day, and there was a couple that sort of came and went. So to me, it's really highlighted that we can do webinars and that people will come. Yeah, they're not going to come in the droves that they come to conferencing necessarily, but people are going to attend, and you're going to get a wide variety of people.
Yeah, but more people probably attended Andrea's session at the conference, unless she was a keynote. She'd have been in a breakout session, and not that many people would have gone. So, and also people have paid. I mean, Lucy would have got it free for the board member, but enough of the people were quite happy to pay £50 or whatever it was to do that session, or for the members, for all three of them. So that's encouraging as well.
Definitely. So I'm very pleased with it all. I think it's went well, and we've had a good range of different things. And I was really pleased with the Monday session as well. I must admit. The Tuesday session. I thought the postgrads all did really well.
Yeah. Thanks very much, Andy, for keeping it all. I think it really does make a difference having somebody like, being there for the more technical.
I was sweating a little bit yesterday, I must say. I was like, it's all going to go wrong. Come back. So, yeah. But no, thank you. Yeah, it's gone.
And given that a few months ago you didn't know anything about Zoom.
No.
Now you're an expert.
You've got the questions, I'm all over this. Love it. Yeah, great stuff.
Brilliant. No problems whatsoever. Then, yeah, at some point, by the time we get into October, because as we were talking about beforehand, it looks like they're now advocating another lockdown in mid-October. We'll start thinking about Leeds and the reality of that and what that may or may not look like.
Do you think you ought to get some presentations lined up just in case we do go into lockdown again? Fire a couple out there when people are sat at home. Might be something to think about.
Yeah.
Just a thought.
I suppose that's our fallback, is to have another online one in May instead of a face-to-face one. But we've got the contract with the hotel that we need to. So we need to work out what the last date is. We can contact them and.
Yeah, I think Mark knows. He's all over that date. It is the date in October. I know that.
Yeah. So. But yeah. Okay. I need to go and get.
Okay.
Thanks very much.
Bye. Have a good weekend. Bye.
Yeah. Bye.
Bye.